Alô,
Hello.
boa
Good
tarde a todos.
afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We are going to start our session about how climate change, how corruption impacts on climate change. I hope that you are all in this final last mile of the COP. You are feeling well, and these are two topics not very much discussed around the world, but we want to make a reflection here and to think how many practices of corruption can impact negatively on climate, and how we can think on practices of transparency and integrity to reduce the problem. And to discuss these two topics, I would like to invite Laura Weisbich. She is senior researcher of the Climate and Security of Igarapé Institute. Laura, thank you. And also invite Sanjeev Heiling, which is the manager of integrity and compliance for the Green Climate Fund. And Minister Isabella would be with us shortly with her reflection. Because we have a guest here speaking English, if you would like to have translation, feel comfortable to use it. So 1, 2, 3, testing the English channel. Can you hear me? So, to explain briefly the dynamics of our conversation, we will have two rounds of discussion, one more focused on the problem of corruption with a reflection on how corruption impacts on climate change, and a second round focused more on solutions. What are the solutions on transparency and integrity that can be used to tackle the problem? And then a third moment of Q&A.
No começo de cada rodada, eu vou
At the
dar
beginning of each round, I'll give a general panorama showing some elements as a provocation to our debate, and then open the discussion with the colleagues here in the panel. So if you could first show.
Só para eu mostrar alguns poucos slides.
My slides here, I have a few. Just to give a brief panorama. First, corruption is a very broad topic. You can understand it in different aspects. For us, it's the abuse of power to private gain. And it's important to bring this concept not to go too far, because broad concepts allow different understanding. So let's focus more on what we are really talking about. And last week, during COP, we launched this survey, which is Atlas of Corruption and Climate, to identify in the Brazilian context the main impacts of corruption in the climate agenda, practice of corruption that are recurring in the mitigation initiatives, adaptation, climate financing. We analyzed 10 cases, concrete cases that took place in the past years in Brazil, and also we produced 10 recommendations. In this first round, I would like to show you specifically the size of the problem, how we identified corruption associated to climate. We cannot read on the fine print, but these are the 10 cases that we analyzed. They are very different topics like public transportation in Rio, the lobby of fossil fuels, actions for illegal exploration of timber in the southern part of Amazonas, the production of fraud carbon credit, land grabbing in the northeast of Bahia. So we have cases in different regions and different topics that show how different practices of corruption impact climate change. And we systematize everything that we found in 5 major impacts of corruption in climate change. The first is corruption, giving a different view to policies related to climate change. Perhaps this is an impact that is harder, more systematic, because we're talking about laws and about public policies that will receive an impact on broad scale. And some of the practices identified was political capture when there is a systematic way of undue influence in a certain public policies, illegal financing of parties and campaigns, misinformation and fake news. The second impact is corruption preventing making energy transition to happen in the right speed. So projects that try to encourage a clean energy that can have a super financing drifts on public resources, favoring fiscal incentives when a person goes to a public sector from private sector, generating conflicts of interest, having as an impact a challenge associated to energy transition. The third impact is corruption, making some environmental crimes feasible and causing a final impact in greenhouse gas emissions. When we see illegal exploration of timber, of land grabbing and illegal mining, we have the bribe of public agents, money washing, asset washing, and these are elements that make these criminal activities feasible. A fourth impact is in the adaptation and response to extreme events, so it is necessary the public efforts and adaptation. When there is an extreme event, the state must mobilize resources very quickly, many times flexibilizing controls of those resources, and then we can have practices like frauds. We can have practices like frauds in tenders, the favoring in the selection of beneficiaries, and drifts in the resources for emergency situations. And finally, to just close this panorama, we have an impact of corruption when we think about the mechanisms of climate financing and on carbon markets. So here we are mentioning especially the resources, and these resources can be drifted, the paralysis on the use of resources, the climate funds in Brazil that we didn't identify drift cases, but paralysis. When a group not to implement a public policy, this group stops the use of that instrument, and this is also a practice of corruption, favoring less efficient projects and frauds in carbon projects without ballast, and that can be in areas that have been grabbed. Then they generate credit that are traded by, but they shouldn't be traded because they are linked to fraud. And this is a panorama for us to start a brief mapping of practices and cases to understand this topic, and also understand the importance of the topic, or the importance of discussing corruptions associated to climate change. And here I would start opening our conversation first with Laura, who is from Institute Igarapé. She's a researcher of the program Climate and Security. She has made very interesting analysis about environmental crimes, their dynamics, but also the crimes that are linked to environmental crime. What are those crimes that make environmental crime possible? So, Laura, what's your opinion? What is the role of corruption? What have you identified in terms of corruption as a present element in the dynamic of environmental crimes?
Can you hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here sharing the space with you. And our resource for everything, what the whole panorama you showed us, we see this link between corruption and environmental topics in the Amazon. So our work was not only in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, but also in Pan-Amazon and other countries. And here in this region, we see the link between deforestation, environmental crisis, and corruption is really very, very strong. So corruption is one of the important elements of this ecosystem of environmental crimes and deforestation, because this is really very, very, very central, and we need to emphasize this. At the same time, we have the idea that corruption happens in the Amazon based on this illicit economy. So the land grabbing, the illegal mining, and the agriculture and livestock on illegal land, and logging. So they have specific entry doors for corruption. So the corruption of public servants that should control and monitor. So this is in a lower level and very linked to another crime that would be the fraud. So the legislation, so we don't have a lack of legislation, but we have this corruption on this level, can be environmental or other secretaries. So here we have police, we have the public servant that should control and that should monitor. This one is linked to corruption. So this first element is very important, and this happened not only in Brazil but in other countries also. And another important topic to understand corruption in the Amazon region. We are not talking about a legal gap without regulation. So we have some deficiencies, but in the regulation, in the law, we have corruption. So in transportation and the trade of products from the Amazon, because it's not a gap anymore. So in this sense, so I would like to make this clear, the fraud of the traceability system, the fraud of legislation is very important when linked to corruption, because here we have public servants violating the law, and that is, and so we have the product laundry. So we talk always about money laundry, but this is a special form that we have the laundry of cattle, of gold, of timber. Because these activities are different than other economies. For example, drugs. Here we have a legal market, but the fact that makes timber or cattle illegal is exactly the fact that the origin of this production is illegal. So here we have falsely that this gold was extracted from a place where it was forbidden. So the illegal origin makes this product laundry, and this is linked to two other crimes, fraud and corruption. So, and I'm going to close for this first moment. We have a lot of studies from different countries: Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. All these studies are available at Igarapé Institute, and they all have a session about corruption. So how is corruption in the Amazon in each of these countries? So I would like to invite you to see more. So we have in Venezuela the topic of mining. Ecuador and Peru is more timber and land. and Brazil is a bit more it's in every economy. So I would like to invite you to get to know our study deeply.
Thank you, Laura. Great panorama for us to understand better this relation between organized crime and corruption. Many times the organized crime causes the effects like deforestation, pollution, but it's important also to analyze the dynamics on the background that supports the environmental crimes and understand these elements that make crimes feasible. Understanding these elements, we can find solutions. Of course, command and control of monitoring at the front end is important, but if corruption makes the environmental crimes feasible, we have to think on anti-corruption measures, integrity measures that solve the problem. And this is what we're going to discuss in this section. But now, going to another topic when we think about climate change, which is climate financing, we have a big challenge, which is to finance the actions of adaptation and mitigation that are necessary and urgent. Resources are rare, and they are also subject to risks of corruption. They need to be protected. And Sanjeev is in this function with a noble mission of managing the integrity of the compliance of Green Climate Fund. I would like to ask you, Sanjeev, what are the risks that you identify of corruption in climate finance, specifically with the experience of the Green Climate Fund? You have the floor, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renato. Yeah, climate change is real and is happening. There's urgency of action, and we need to channel climate finance to a climate initiative, whether it is mitigating action or adaptation project. So, so here we have the urgency of action, which is very important to address the emerging climate challenges that we are facing. And we also have political commitment at the national level. And coupled with that, we have the complexity of the project and the huge sum of money that need to be injected in this project. Unfortunately, these elements are the recipe for malpractices, for corruption. And there's urgent need for us to put into practice mitigating factors in order to address this risk. So from my side, what we've seen is the emergence of certain corruption risks, what surfaces actually on climate-related project or conflict of interest, which is very predominant. It appears during the decision-making process and also in the project life cycle during implementation of the project. So where public interest is compromised by private interests. We also have another area of high risk, which is procurement. Procurement is an area where there's a lot of malpractices, nepotism, cronyism find its way in procurement areas and in the allocation of contract to close relatives and friends. And we also have tailor-made specification to favor specific bidders. We have manipulation of bid during the evaluation process. We also have sharing of bid information, that is insider information to against payment to external bidders. So all these potential corruption risks, of course, limit competition and have a direct consequence on climate-related project, which affects the community at large, which are vulnerable not only to corruption, but also to the climate consequence of climate. So last year in COP26, we highlighted the impact of corruption risk on adaptation project, and we refer to it as maladaptation. And maladaptation is in fact a combination of corruption risks that can occur on a maladaptation project. and it can derail the project from its original goal, which means that ultimately the money is diverted and we don't have, and this have an impact on the goal because we can't achieve the goal as we initially set. And not only that, and the issue of maladaptation, instead of addressing the consequence of corruption, is causing the opposite. So here we have the dual factor. Not only the vulnerable population is not benefiting from the climate fund, but it's also having a negative impact because of corruption. So in a nutshell, corruption risk is very dynamic in nature. It's very dynamic, it is evolving, hence the need to be continuously, to control corruption, to come up with a risk mitigation strategy. And this is what I will be talking in the second part, how we are going to address corruption risk in a fast evolving climate space. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Sanjeev trouxe, acho que ótimo mapeamento, né, dos riscos de corrupção aplicados ao financiamento.
Yes, this was a nice mapping of corruption risks and how important it is to protect our resources. It's interesting, Minister. So we have a robust fund, and this was not enough when suddenly administration wants to paralyze everything. So we really need robust mechanisms. So all the financial instruments that are created can really be used so they're not paralyzed as they were in Brazil. So thank you for coming, for joining us. We know you have a lot to do. You had a lot of experience. You were minister from 2010 and 2016, and you saw how difficult it is to protect climate from these influences. How do you see the relationship between these two topics, corruption and climate change, in public administration?
Vou tentar aqui fazer uma provocação.
I'm just trying to provoke. I worked for more than 30 years as a public servant. I'm not a member of a political party, and I was a minister in the government of Mr. Lula and Dilma. Brazil has institutional capacities to not contaminate policies with interests that are not from the state. I'm very proud as public servant. I worked more than 34 years. I never had litigation against me. This should not be an exception. That should be a rule, should be normal, because we have really a very strict regulation, not only in the law of a public servant in environmental area. So we have also the environmental law. So the only public servant that is not only subject to administration law, but also environmental law. So see the arrangement from Brazil to protect and talk about integrity. And even though the corruption situation, this is part we were the third ministry that dismissed more people. So to tackle corruption, you need to go through all instances of decision making. So from the president until the chief of storage. So when we talk about crimes, and today we see this in Brazil, the erosion of the institution, that the political will to tackle corruption is not present in the political hierarchy in the country. This is very important. You need to talk about mechanisms, about credibility to access resources, because we have three situations that are very important. First is the lack of credibility and the impact on the image of the country. That's what we're seeing today. We have the backsets, and also the word seeing that corruption can contaminate decision-making processes in the country. And it was possible to fight and to solve these processes. But another topic is how society is perceiving corruption. Society perhaps thinks, oh, climate change is a topic that can bring corruption, and then the society wants to get away from this agenda. Also, private sector that wanted to evolve after the corruption scandals. But we see companies with a new compliance system, and then agents of the government trying to undergo this compliance systems. So our point of view should not be manipulated by public situations to create situations that can bring a lot of fake and lies. And this contaminates the third aspect. This is how we as a citizen handle this, because sometimes we get used to this situation. Everything seems like a number. So we go to the Amazon, as we heard here, not only with transparency, but about the effects. But when we have the biggest situations of homicide, we have in the Amazon, and especially in the municipalities with most deforestation. And Brazilians accept deforestation in the Amazon or in Brazil. And to go against deforestation is not to be against agriculture. The crimes that uses agriculture or livestock to launder money. So this contaminates the image of the growers and the Brazilians. So, of course, we need to talk about this, because otherwise you're going to get used to a situation just thinking, oh, there's no use, there's no way to change this. Because, of course, most of the Brazilian society is against this corruption. We are very nice, very happy people, but now we have hate and we have polarization. This is not acceptable in the society, because it's based on ignorance and hiding the truth. So the privilege of the power today in Brazil is be ignorant. They think they are part of the elite because they are ignorant, because today they destroyed all the institutions to take away education and culture. So it's privilege of ignorance. So then people who don't want transparency have the power. And now the private sector creating jobs needs to see the performance, because I have an agriculture here with people, companies that want to promote their business, and they don't think that these illegal topics are okay. And then suddenly they get into this situation of deforestation, of money laundering and cattle laundering. And this is a difficult situation for the compliance internationally and here in the country. That's bad for civil society, because civil society is just reacting and producing reports, and all the institutions get very fragile. We have an erosion, and then perhaps the most important thing, the erosion of the democracy. So our decision is taken away from us. So climate situation is something that is modeling our development agenda. And here we have not only these challenges, how to tackle crime and corruption and what typology of crimes you have, because this is contaminated and we already have this, and we want institutions. On the other hand, we have a huge opportunity to reformulate political spaces, so then Brazilian citizens can be protected against this ignorance. And these situations that we cannot accept as a society. So I cannot understand people having a weapon in hand, armed in São Paulo, saying we are defending the Brazilian population. That's not okay. So to fight corruption is to get Brazil back, to see our commitment with the state. We have the public power to work together with society and not to use society. And this is what we want in our democracy. That's my challenge. And I think we're going to start a new era with digital technological topics, and it can be used today. Today it's being used for fake green, and now we need to use it for good green. These are our obligations as citizens, not only against corruption, but we need to try to have a transparent processes, and we need to educate people. We are a creative country. We have a lot of nice people, and we really are looking for honesty, and let's strengthen our institutions. And if we have corruption, well, then we need to tackle this. So we all have this mission, and it's not tolerable to erode the institutions in this country. And from January 1st on, we are strengthening our institution. That's it. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, ministra.
Thank you, Minister. The challenge is not small. I believe that the words that we heard here, trying to give name to the problem. So we have misinformation, lack of transparency, undue influence, fraud, the drift of public resources, money laundering. So a big geological tree of bad practices that unfortunately are part, and they are crossing the climate policies either in the public sector or in the private sector or in society itself. We have to fight these practices so that climate action becomes effective. With this, we open our second round because we talked about the problem. Now let's try to tackle on the solutions. What can we do? And Minister already mentioned some elements about this to protect public institutions, the policies, the funds from this kind of undue influence that many times drift the action of the state from this climate struggle. I will start again with Laura. Laura, in the perspective of climate crimes, and in this round that we are expecting here in Brazil of an effective fight against climate crimes, what are the main elements, especially corruption? Well, the answer of the millions are also a genealogical tree, but coming with that recognition that corruption has different forms, so the solutions also go through different strategic instruments. Start with the first one, which is the recognition of this link. I agree with the minister. It is apparent that Brazil has state capacity and political will, it has already shown, and instruments to fight corruption. The point is, these instruments that are there, are they focusing specifically on this link with the climate crimes in our code? For instance, when we are talking in the Amazon, we believe not. And we have some specific doors to create a capacity again, a specific mirroring on these corruption elements, fraud that are happening, for instance, in the Amazon region. If we don't have state capacity specifically, we won't be able somehow to reduce deforestation, which is our final objective. So the fight of corruption has been in the cross strategy of the government. Otherwise, the objective of fighting deforestation, of zeroing it, won't be achieved. Example, we have today a network, a national strategy to fight money laundering and corruption. This strategy, which is an articulation of different government agencies, needs and should have a specifically view to this point of environmental crime, because this shows a political will on a articulation level and a future work agenda that will unfold then in different organisms, so that this view of the link between corruption and environmental crimes is a daily activity of the different agencies. For instance, the Federal Reserve. It's important that we see this capacity. So this is the first element, to recognize that it is important and that each of the different sectors that already work and have these components also focus specifically on a caveat to the corruption linked to these crimes. The second element, and here we are in the arena, I made we worked in these last periods with the federal police. In our mapping, showed 21% of the operations investigating crimes of corruption that were linked to the environmental crimes that were being dealt with. So 21%. So the federal police then already is aware that corruption is part of this ecosystem. So we need to improve the federal police capacity in the Amazon states in articulation with other agencies of police in other places, because the commodities, they travel from the Amazon for trading centers outside the Amazon. So gold laundering happens, for instance, in São Paulo. So federal police needs a specific capacity. We need more investigative capacity together with other agencies, for instance, finance intelligence. And this finance intelligence can and have in some cases a component of international cooperation, because these commodities, they travel not only to other states, but also to other countries. Why did I say it was a tree using the same metaphor? Because it's very complex. And last but not least, I would like to tackle on one point that the minister mentioned about political will, and mentioned the point of regulation. I know that it believes that it is a big leap when we talk specific capacity of fighting corruption for regulation. But bottom line, again, I'm talking about Amazon specifically. Gold mining, gold in the Amazon is an asset that is very little regulated. It's very flawed, this regulation. And we are talking about transparency, traceability. And if we think of them in regulation, would also help to fight corruption. So In this tree, we have the capacities of the agencies, of the officials, and the capacity of the executive and legislative of improving legislation to improve transparency and traceability in this arena of product trading. And this is very specific to the Amazon, but we will hear other things about financing. And I wanted to mention this, and then to close with that point, that we are going to do as of January 23 onwards, a political will either of revoking acts of normative corruption, all of them. In the past years, we have seen the approval of laws and regulations that hurt constitutional principles, or even this social environmental protection of the Amazon. We need political will for this, because it was an act of normative corruption. And we have to go through a fine screening so that we can return to this capacity of the states, of the officials, and also for the normative and political framework that help us to move onwards with this problem of corruption, reaching integrity, so that we can think on other models of development, starting in foundations where the climate agenda is more robust, with better governance, with integrity. So the ecosystem of crime is complex, and the ecosystem of the solutions is as well. But we have to highlight all these branches of the tree. Okay, good, Laura. Thank you for bringing this. Thank you for bringing this group of solutions. And I would like to highlight only two things. One is how we can improve the systems of control of the productive chain so that they are less susceptible to fraud and practice of corruption. Minister knows very well the story of DOF. The control of timber was via PPF, which was a physical document that was linked to the transportation of timber. Imagine how susceptible to fraud was a physical document that anyone could then replicate, even with a bribe, have access to a TPF, and like this, turn an illegal timber to a legal one. Today we have the DOFI and then SINAFLOR. It improved a lot the model of the control, but even though there is room for fraud. So how can we evolve in this system to control gold, timber, cattle, so that it will be more difficult every time to turn illegal things into legal things? And Brazil created an anti-laundering institution. We have laws, we have instruments, but they are not mobilized and present in the climate environmental agenda. So this requires our effort of bringing these institutions. We have the union controllership, we have the accounts courts and COAFI and others that can be present in the climate agenda. So it's a field of solutions that is very interesting. I will skip the order because the minister has a appointment right after. And to bring your contribution, Minister, we talked about the problem. What's the solution? How can we build a state and more harness public policies less susceptible to the practice of corruption?
Well, I can give you two examples. You have the prevention. This is when you are in public administration, and you have the reaction when you don't see what's happening in the crime chain. So when you talk about these institutions, I'm going to give you a clear example. Something that is in the law, when you have sanctions, penalties. I was really enforcer. When you give penalties, you need to write the sanction and put exactly the place of the crime to state it. And if just one number is wrong, then the whole process stops. So we don't have the punishment and everything stops. So when I was in the ministry, I said, well, let's see this, and I saw that we had some penalties of IBAMA in Africa and in the White House. So then we developed the electronic system. So then the enforcer can localize this via satellite and not change the numbers. And this would be sent automatically. And then really, if you, once you have the electronic localization, everything is fine. Or for example, the monitoring, just put a chip in the cars, not only at IBAMA, to trace it. And then we were able to tackle this industry. So we were able to trace everything with technology. So here we have two examples you don't put in your study. And we have a lot of corruption because here they are taking money away from public sector and taking money away from the Brazilians. And what does that mean? You have leakages, and a crime seems to be very profitable. I never saw a criminal that is not creative. They're very charming. So, and especially the mafiosi, they're very charming. They're all celebrating in carnival, and then suddenly they're in prison. So you really need, it's important to have solution, because you may not seduce society just to try to find a solution. So it's really very important. In Brazil, you have legality, illegality, and in the midst, you have the informality. And we need to abandon this concept. We need, do you think that people in the Amazon that are waiting for 30, 40 years for the deeds for the land, are they criminals? No, they're not, because they just are not recognized by the state. They have no civil rights. They have a thing. They have a land that's not theirs, and the reality, the political and social reality, is that he has no access to everything. Is he a criminal? So when you open all these boxes, you see that we have a lot of injustices, and they are provoked by the crimes. That's the same thing as we have in the cities. So land grabbing we have in the Amazon, but we also have land grabbing in the big cities in Rio de Janeiro. So you're not seeing, but in the shanty towns, Vidigal, Rocinha, they know it, and they just live with it. So Brazilians should solve and should request transparent processes. So understand climate topic as an opportunity to be more integral and less prone to informality. So otherwise, we are going to be always between a bit more honest, bit less honest. So this informality, this Brazilian jeitinho, this informality, this does not exist. So, and that's what Brazilians need to understand. We need a political integrity of the country. We cannot tolerate this. So we have 5 representatives, 5 politicians in Rio de Janeiro in prison. So they are all in the whole city in Rio de Janeiro. You're exposed to violence because of corruption. And I'm telling this because we need new lenses. We need to prepare society to tackle corruption. we don't need to polarize the society. We just need to understand how this nice way, this informality is tolerating things that hide a very deep corruption in this country. So I don't, so I do eat meat, right? And I drink caipirinha, always organic, I hope so. But I cannot think that I'm going to eat meat without deforestation because China and France want it. So we need to tackle corruption. We need to understand this in our own country. When I go to the communities in the city, we need to see how serious it is. So the attitude of people there, how they try to be honest, but they have no help from state, from public administration. Sometimes public administration is corrupt and they use most vulnerable citizens. And this needs to end. We need more transparency. The users of social networks just block fake news, just block them. This, I think this would be the first civic act in this country. Just block. So they're so creative. They're so crazy. I saw a video that a woman said that January 1st, Bolsonaro will change his color to incorporate Lula. So that's crazy. They're so crazy. And it's important to have information and have objective informations because we are living in a world where you can get the truth and lies at the same time, and we need transparency. And we are going to do this with institutions. And because well, we have here processes. We don't need this fantasy that this is a problem for other countries. That's not. It's our problem. Because if you want to buy something, just ask for a certificate. And at this corruption process, Lava Jato, we saw that a lot of jewelry stores were part of this scheme. So we think we as consumer, as citizens, as Brazilians, we need to change our attitude. This starts with your neighbor. This starts with people that sometimes don't pay their bills and say, well, I'm right, or sometimes taxi driver need to pay a fee to use the streets. So this is against our interests. So we need to change the political education. We need to change the commitment against corruption. And we should not let climate agenda be a victim of corruption. So I discovered that here in Brazil, we have federal cattle and state cattle, because the cattle is illegal, but it is not illegal on the state level because they get the medicine certificate and they're vaccinated. So this is really crazy, and we need to leave behind what's not tolerable. That's a culture we have since we were founded. I was in Japan and I was very impressed. In 2019, I asked how many times Tokyo police fired a shot. And she said 6 times. And I had my bike, and someone said, "Well, you can leave the bike here." And I, when I came back 24 hours later, the bike was still there. This is a pact in society. So we need to define what we want as a society. Otherwise, we are going to have this asymmetrical situation. So we have the power, and we need to change everything, and we need to change this situation. And we need to have this climate action as an asset. So I'm sorry, I need to leave, and I'm going to have, I have a meeting.
Against corruption, but with protection, ok? And muito obrigada a vocês todos. Tá? Até logo. Sorry. Ah, eu sou morte dele também.
So, yes, and I'm sorry, I'm going to leave now. Thank you, Isabella.
So thank you, Minister. Now moving to the end of our session, I believe that the Minister brought from a specific example of digital transformation, even the political decision and social decision that we need to fight corruption, showing the challenge and complexity of solutions. But I'll now like to turn to our last comment of Sanjay, that with his experience on the Green Climate Fund, and his position is protecting with integrity and compliance practice the resources of the financing of the fund. So I would like to know, Sanjay, what are the best practices of the fund that should be implemented in other contexts of climate financing to protect against corruption?
So in fact, we've seen that how corruption can undermine climate action. So I would like to say is that integrity matters. There's no place for integrity. As the minister said, we need to bring awareness at all levels, at the political level, at the donors, implementers, and even at the community level, working together with civil society, etc., to make them aware of the impact of corruption on their project and how it can impact their life, because corruption and climate change share certain commonalities because it affects the vulnerable population, the vulnerable who are affected by climate change. So it's important that the fight against corruption is the concern of each and everyone. So there need to be collective action, so for greater efficiency and effectiveness in climate project. So at the level of the Green Climate Fund is the highest financier in climate action. So we ensure we have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that our fund are disbursed for its intended purpose. That is, the fund are not diverted for prohibited practices like fraud, corruption, money laundering, or terrorism financing. So we have a responsibility to ensure integrity of the fund. So we do it a different front. At the upfront, we have an accreditation process, which is basically that we accredit implementers, that is on the ground, because we don't implement project, but we use the accredited entity on the ground at country level or at the regional level to implement this project. So we ensure that they have at least the minimum fiduciary standard to be eligible to GCF funding. And this, they have to go through a reaccreditation process after 5 years to ensure at least they have the minimum standard, like the appropriate policy to deal with prohibited practices. But of course, when we are talking, as I mentioned earlier, corruption risk is dynamic. Even though you have that initial mechanism in place, you have to be vigilant, you have to be proactive, and you have to develop a risk-based approach to ensure that corruption or prohibited practices do not creep up into your system. So over and above that, we, as part of the accountability mechanism of the Green Climate Fund, we have the independent integrity unit from where I am from. We have a dual mandate which has a investigative mandate. So this is, we do an investigation following allegation of malpractices. And if the case is substantiated, then there may be sanction. Sanction, depending on the gravity of the sanction, it can be debarment from benefiting GCF funding. And until they restructure themselves and comply with our compliance and standard to be re-eligible for GCF funding. This is at the investigative response, but given the urgency of climate action, we tend to favor a proactive approach, that is a preventative approach. And this is what we have been lately, our focus. And we have developed a prevention tool, which is known as a proactive integrity review. We use artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify projects who have high risk, who show high risk of, who shows red flag in their system. And what we do is we identify those priority projects, and we conduct an in-depth review to identify any loophole for actual or potential prohibited practices. And we come up with a list of recommendation for the implementers or the accredited entity at the national level to implement. So it is more a collaborative approach with our partners, and we help them to build up capacity, to institutional capacity, so that to develop a more robust system to counteract any prohibited practice. This is more a preventative approach, and we believe that prevention is better than cure. And also, as the minister was saying, ignorance, and we advocate integrity in climate action, integrity in whatever project we are implementing. And for this to be achievable, it's not only by one institution we can do it. We need to have collective action. And this is precisely what we have done in COP27. We have launched the Joint Integrity Partnership with Civil Society Organization. That is, we consider civil society as important actors in advocating integrity, in helping the community to instill integrity in climate action. So these are some of the prevention activities that we engage with, but we are open to develop different prevention tools, like knowledge product that we can share with our entities, lesson learned, and we also work collaboratively with our partners on the ground, like national entity, in building capacity, in providing them advice on policy development related to integrity, and also in building capacity like awareness, what is conflict of interest, what is segregation of duties, and all these, how to improve the system for the better benefit, for greater efficiency and effectiveness of climate action.
Perfeito, Sanjeev. Muito obrigado por trazer esse panorama.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you very much for this panorama of compliance and practices. Very important to protect the scarce resources that we have for climate financing in the Brazilian context, where we are expecting a resume of flows of financing for the climate in national funds and international cooperation. Is very important to implement these best practices to guarantee that the resources from financing are implemented for climate action. I would like to thank very much Laura and Sanjeev for your participation, Minister Isabella who left us, everybody who's here presentially and online. We have already exceeded our time, so we cannot make questions, but we can here continue a few minutes if anybody has any question after we close the session, right? So thank you very much and see you next time. Thank you very much.